simplifying your UPSC journey. Welcome to Akshar Manthan. Learn, reflect, conquer.
Every political theory must eventually answer one question. How much space does the individual get before they hit the limits of the state? Liberalism answers this by placing the individual at the absolute center of the universe. The core premise is that human beings are rational, and individual liberty is the supreme political value. But look at the historical record. Over the last 300 years, this exact same ideology has been used to justify both the aggressive dismantling of governments and the construction of massive interventionist welfare states. This contradiction exists because liberalism is not a fixed doctrine. It is an adaptive meta-ideology. When faced with a systemic crisis, it mutates its core definitions to survive. This matrix tracks these mutations. The x-axis measures the state's role, from minimal police force to maximal welfare provider. The y-axis measures human nature, from atomistic, isolated individuals at the bottom to deeply embedded social communities at the top. By identifying where a specific era plots human nature on this vertical axis, we can predict the exact economic policies it will impose on the horizontal one. The first iteration of this ideology emerged as a radical response to the rigid hierarchies of feudalism and the divine right of kings. To break that absolute monarchical power, thinkers like John Locke established a baseline of human nature known as possessive individualism. They argued that a person is the sole proprietor of their own skills, owing nothing to society for them. This created the concept of the atomistic man, the assumption that individuals are inherently self-sufficient, highly rational, and driven purely by ego and self-interest. If you believe humans are self-sufficient atoms, you measure freedom strictly by the absence of external coercion. In political theory, this is called negative liberty, the right to simply be left alone. Plotting this on our matrix places classical liberalism in the extreme bottom left quadrant. This position dictates a night watchman state. Government function is strictly limited to protecting private property, maintaining domestic order, and enforcing contracts. Everything else is left to the market. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Adam Smith translated this into laissez-faire industrial capitalism. The state stepped back, and market forces of supply and demand were left to allocate resources without interference. While classical liberalism successfully shattered the feudal order, its absolute insistence on negative liberty created a system entirely devoid of safeguards for the working class it relied upon to function. Treating workers strictly as isolated expendable units resulted in severe exploitation. As wealth concentrated heavily at the top, the working class faced brutal conditions, fueling the rapid rise of labor movements and the looming threat of socialism. To survive this crisis, the ruling class realized the capitalist system required protection from its own excesses. Liberalism had to absorb the socialist critique regarding inequality without sacrificing the primacy of the individual. Thinkers like T.H. Green and Harold Lasky accomplished this by injecting idealism into the ideology. They rejected the atomistic man entirely, arguing instead that humans are naturally social and developmental beings whose potential is tied to their community. They introduced positive liberty, grounding freedom in an individual's actual capacity and material resources to achieve fulfillment, a sharp turn away from the previous focus on mere non-interference. This ideological pivot travels across our matrix, moving the baseline of human nature to the top and drastically expanding the required role of the state to the right. The state was no longer viewed as a necessary evil. It became a source of virtue. To guarantee positive liberty, the state massively expands to regulate work hours, enforce wages, and provide comprehensive social security. Modern liberalism saved capitalism by transforming the state into a mechanism to remove obstacles to individual development. This mutation built the 20th century welfare state. By the 1970s, that massive architecture was buckling under its own weight. The welfare state had grown into a bloated administrative apparatus, suffering from legitimation crises, soaring fiscal deficits, and severe economic stagnation.
Intellectuals like F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman launched a counter-revolution. They argued that central planning was a guaranteed road to serfdom, and that state-mandated social justice was an unachievable mirage that only destroyed economic growth. Political leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan operationalized these theories, initiating an era of neoliberalism. This caused a violent snapback on our ideological matrix. Neoliberalism rejected positive liberty and returned to the atomistic bottom-left principles of the 18th century, but pushed even further into strict market fundamentalism. By 1989, these policies were codified into the Washington Consensus, a strict checklist designed to roll back the state entirely. The pillars of this consensus were uncompromising: aggressive privatization of public assets, sweeping deregulation of industry, the removal of trade barriers, and massive cuts to public subsidies to reduce fiscal deficits.
The comprehensive welfare safety net was discarded in favor of the trickle-down effect. The assumption was that untethered market growth at the top would eventually benefit those at the bottom. Neoliberalism stripped the state back to its classical bones. It operated on the premise that human freedom is only fully realized when the free market operates as the ultimate arbiter of human value. Throughout the 1990s, neoliberalism was exported globally through structural adjustment programs and institutions like the IMF and WTO. This globalized capitalism generated vast wealth, but also resulted in deep democratic deficits and extreme wealth concentration. As it became clear that the trickle-down effect was failing the working class and developing nations, civil society mobilized. Protests against global market fundamentalism forced the ideology to adapt once again. Economists like Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz formulated a new synthesis to replace the failing Washington Consensus. This became known as social liberalism. Sen introduced the concept of capacity building. He argued that the state should not command the economy or provide direct employment through bloated public sectors. Instead, the state's role is to invest heavily in human infrastructure, specifically health, education, and skill development. On the matrix, this evolution settles in the upper middle region. It acknowledges the social nature of human beings without requiring maximum state control of the economy. Social liberalism attempts to thread the needle. It harnesses the raw engine of the capitalist market to generate growth, while utilizing the state strictly to ensure individuals possess the actual capacity to compete within it. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, liberalism appeared to have permanently defeated all its ideological rivals. This apparent total victory led political scientist Francis Fukuyama to propose his end of history thesis. He argued that Western liberal democracy and capitalist economics represented the final, most rational endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution. But this premise was quickly challenged. Samuel Huntington countered with the clash of civilizations, arguing that history is a permanent phenomenon. He predicted that deep-seated cultural, religious, and civilizational identities, not economic models, would become the primary sources of global conflict. The events of September 11th brutally shattered the optimism of the 1990s. It proved that large segments of the globe completely rejected the Western premise of the rational, atomistic man. In many developing nations and non-Western cultures, political systems often prioritize communitarianism and collective identity over individualism. These societies actively resist Western liberal frameworks, providing fertile ground for alternative systems of governance. Looking at this matrix reveals the reality of liberalism. It moves from minimal to maximal, snaps back to minimal, and attempts to find a balanced center. Liberalism hasn't brought an end to history. Its survival as an ideology depends entirely on its continued ability to mutate, constantly renegotiating the fragile boundary between the power of the state and the freedom of the individual.